I'm Keith McDaniel. My background is counseling. I've done counseling for nearly 30 years. I've worked in the Employee Assistance Program at First Health. Now I work for the foundation providing counseling for physicians, wives, and families through the Provider Wellbeing program. I've been doing that now for several years. I also have a private practice in counseling. My background is in marriage and family therapy, and I've worked for hospice here doing grief counseling. I did that for nearly 10 years. So a very varied background. So what we want to start off talking about today is grief and loss, and we'll add into that some of the COVID effect in terms of how that impacts grief. But let me just start off talking a little bit in general about grief and the grief process. There is no right and wrong way to grieve. And when I was doing the majority of my grief counseling, people would come in and say, my mom or my dad or whatever's doing this or that, and they go to the cemetery every day and spend 30 minutes. And I said, the one thing you need to know about grief and loss is, as long as you're not hurting yourself or someone else, you can do it any way you want. There's no right and wrong way to grieve. So that's very important to keep in mind. I spoke with a lady one time whose grown children came to see me and said, Mom, after her husband had died, said, you've got to see her. She won't do anything but sit on the sofa. And I said, is she hurting anybody, or is that hurting her? Well, no. I said, well, then let her sit on the sofa. When she gets tired of sitting on the sofa, then she'll get up. And then in another month or so, she did. She started going back to work. She started doing her regular routine. You just have to give people space enough to do the grief the way that they feel they need to. And as I said, it's always different for everyone. And I always coach people about some rituals they can do at holidays in order to help them with the grieving process, things they can do to remember their loved ones. Give you a personal example. When my dad died, which has been many years ago now, we were living in Columbia, South Carolina, and he had been to our house on a weekend to help me do some things around. And before he left, we had a fig tree out beside of the garage. And my dad loved figs, and he would go out there and pull those figs off of the tree and just stand there and eat them. And before he left that weekend, he said, now, I want to tell you something. He said, if something happens to me, then I want to make sure that you take care of your mom. I said, well, Dad, you're fine. You're going to be fine. Well, the following Friday night, I get a phone call from my mom saying, your dad is in the hospital. We think he's had a heart attack. So we jump in the car. This was outside of Charlotte. Fly up to the hospital as fast as we could, get out of the car, go into the emergency room, and he was gone. So after that, when I went back home to Columbia, I walked into the garage and I noticed, because we had trimmed the fig tree, I noticed that the clippers were not where I usually put them. So I knew he had hung up the clippers. So, and this is how your mind works when you're grieving. You do crazy stuff. But I would not move those clippers for 1 year. I left them exactly where they were, that he had put them, because my thinking was, as long as those are there, then he's here. Obviously he wasn't, but that's how you think when you're grieving. So after a year, my son, who was then about, I think 8 or 9 years old, I said, Brandon, I said, let's go out and trim the fig tree, because it was time to trim it again. So we did. And after we trimmed the fig tree, we took the clippers that he had used that were hanging in the garage, and we buried them under the fig tree. They probably are still there. But ever since then, whenever we've moved to a new place, which has been 2 or 3 times, the first thing I do when we move is I plant a fig tree. I have a huge fig tree growing off of my deck where we currently live. And my son, who went through all of that with me, that's the first thing he does when he moves, is he plants a fig tree in the yard. And that's how we remember my dad. All of that said, just to reinforce again how individualized grieving is and what some of the things are you can do to help you with the process. At Christmas time, you can put up some kind of tree that doesn't have any decorations or anything on it. And when the family comes together, you give them something, each of them different, and they can go and hang it on a tree. And they can say something about the loved one who's not there that year. And that's real helpful in terms of the family coming together and being able to recognize the person who's no longer there, but yet they can remember them. And then they can keep the tree they've hung these ornaments on up as long as they feel like it's helpful. So any number of ways to do this grieving process. And of course with COVID now, that presents yet another aspect of the process because it's an unknown. And I've caught myself thinking, what if I get this? What would that mean? What would that mean to my wife? What would that mean to my family? So it adds a lot of different components to the grieving process. So just be aware, in anything that you're feeling during this process, keep in mind it's normal. It is very normal to feel and think about this in ways that you may have not considered it before. I'd like to invite anybody who's listening or has heard any of these videos to know that if you would like to come see me privately, you can do that through the Provider Wellbeing Network. You could call Dr. Jerry, who is a psychiatrist, and he can make the referral, but you can call me directly. And my number is 910-690-7743. And I have a private office, very confidential. Nobody will know you're coming unless you tell them. So if you listen to any of these, or for any other reason you feel like you'd like to talk to a counselor, please don't hesitate to call, and it will cost you nothing.